Welcome to Podcasting Smarter, the podcast for and by podcasters. We interview podcasters for the real scoop on podcasting. Whether you're thinking about starting a podcast or have been podcasting for years, you'll find lots of inspiration, valuable lessons, and tips in our interviews. This podcast is brought to you by Podbean. Please visit podbean.com, the home for podcasters.
Hey there, everybody. This is John from Podbean and Podcasting Smarter. On today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Marty from Vmware, speaking about internal podcasts and how you can use podcasts in your business. Marty, how are you today?
I'm doing very well.
Perfect. Again, thank you so much for making the time to sit down with us. So let's get started a little bit, talk a little bit about how Vmware started to integrate podcasts into their work. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about Vmware and what you guys are about.
Sure. We're an enterprise software company. We are the leader in virtualization software, focusing on both desktop virtualization as well as data center virtualization. So the team that I work with is focused on sales training, and that's where we've been leveraging the podcasts for our internal audience. There's a whole different group that handles customer-facing and partner-facing podcasts out to the rest of the world, but we have really taken up the idea of using podcasts as a secure internal communication method for really the last couple, 3 years now, and we've seen great adoption and great success from it.
What was the catalyst that made your company say, communication across our company could probably be done a little bit more effectively through podcasting?
Yeah, so twofold really. One was a great experience that I had in a previous life working actually with a group in HP software where we had done, this was many years ago, we had done kind of an internal version of podcasting that was based on SharePoint and video-based, very manual, very difficult. We weren't able to leverage the ease of publishing and the simplicity that you get on a podcasting platform like Podbean. We had to do it all manually. But we had great success with the field and our audience. And as I moved into the role here at VMware, we had been pushing this agenda for many years and finally got the kind of right combination of people that believed in the need for greater and better communication, as well as a little extra budget available for one quarter. We got to try it as a pilot, and as expected, it was as successful with the field as we thought it would be, and it's just kind of grown from there.
What do you think were some of the things that have made it successful so far? I mean, one of the things that we see a lot here at Podbean are when people start using podcasts for internal communications, internal training, they find that the engagement with the material is a lot deeper. It's something where you can listen to these on the go. It's something where it's in an audio or video format. Was that something that you found that that you were able to leverage a little more?
Definitely. I think just the overall adoption of podcasts, especially among our technical audience, people are listening to podcasts already. And so that was a huge benefit to us. The other piece was actually more of a negative from a different perspective. Our learning management system and our other communications tools really didn't have a good offline playback experience available within them. So as people, especially again, this technical audience that does a lot of traveling, they're not able to sit down and take their training or to review information when they're on a plane. Whereas everyone else loads up some podcasts to have available for their plane ride, and you get to enjoy episodes while you're logging miles. So it was really the fact that we couldn't deliver the training that they were asking for in any other way other than via a podcast type solution. But of course, this content had to be secure. So that was the big piece that really drove us to Podbean, is that ability to have a SSO authenticated verification before people are able to download and consume this content. So it was really driven by the audience themselves.
Security seems like something that a lot of enterprise companies, such as yourselves, is something that you value with your internal communications podcasts also. Is that something where, like, let's say a scrambled URL wasn't something that was necessarily an option that you guys could really do? You needed to have that SSO login to have that level of security?
Yeah, definitely. By the time the security team found out what we were trying to do, they kind of mandated that it be behind the SSO authentication, and rightfully so. This is important information that our field needs to have that is very sensitive, right? So it needs to be behind that layer of protection. We just, quite frankly, didn't want to risk the opportunity for some of that stuff to trickle out via, like you said, a hidden URL, or just the fact that no one knows it's out there isn't a good enough protection. Whereas it may have been several years ago, certainly today that's just not the case.
Of course. In 2019, I think we take for granted the fact that technology and the digital era, as great as it is still very accessible if you just try hard enough to find the content. And if you want to make sure it's super secure, having it behind an SSO, email, and password, that's really the best way to go. Are you using the Podbean software and podcasting for training also as well as internal communication?
Yeah, so we've got about 10 different channels. I'd say 8 of those are very active. There's a couple that have kind of come and gone over the past couple of years. But I would say we break those down by audience. So we have one that's traditionally aimed at our core sales team. Then we have several different technical groups that are getting information directly kind of served up to them. So we have shows that appear on those channels that are targeted to different products or maybe from different executives. So some of those are communication based, and some of them are definitely tied into a training plan. So we've actually gone above and beyond what is typical for a Podbean implementation, at least we think so, in working with the technical folks on your side. And we've actually created some connections between the Podbean episodes and a corresponding course in our learning management system. So we use Saba Cloud, and we've made a connection there that we use a little bit of scripting on the back end to help mark people complete for having consumed training content as they are getting credit or as they are downloading or listening to an episode. So again, we're trying to meet the need of our end user of having a better offline viewing or listening experience for mandatory or recommended training, and we're using Podbean to do that. We're just making that connection on the back end, saying that if you've listened to this episode, we're going to give you credit for achieving this course as part of your training plan. So that has been something that we have utilized for the last several years now. And again, we're doing more and more of that. But I'd say it's about 60-40. 60% of its communication or consume at your leisure type content. The other 40% would be more mandated or stuff that we want to make sure everyone is getting on a regular basis, and we're actually tracking back whether or not they've listened. So using it more as a training tool instead of just an education or a learn at your own pace tool.
And I like how you said that you kind of divvy it up between each of the different, let's say, departments. You have about 7 different podcasts. You have built in the ability for you to look back and see who's listened to the content and really get to check off in such a granular way. When a lot of companies start off, they see podcasting as a really great solution. A lot of the time it's difficult to go back and say, or see rather, who has already completed the content, who's been able to digest it, or where to break that down. I know for us, we have our own engagement intel that we use. Is that something you've integrated as well? Or is most of that handled on VMware side, like solely?
Yeah, so we're leveraging, again, there's a couple folks on our side that have worked with the reporting team there to get, in essence, an automated dump of content every night that allows us to then, again, do a little parsing of that data, because it captures the email address, of course, of the person listening, and then for the most part, the time that they've spent listening. And then that gives us the data that we need to pull the trigger and mark them complete for that particular course. So again, it's that SSO integration coupled with some work that we're doing on the back end with our LMS that allows us to do that.
Now, a question I have for you specifically, I think one of the biggest things for when we talk to a lot of these companies, they usually say things like, well, we're not really sure about how to create the content. How are we going to break up the training? How are we going to deliver weekly newsletter? How are we going to make sure that all of our people are getting what they need? And you've already covered the the checking off of listening to the podcast, but what is your ease of recording and producing content for people to listen to?
Yeah, so again, almost as varied as the topics and the channels that we have. We're lucky that several of the channel owners or the people that are administering or really the major contributors are kind of podcast geeks like me, and they've taken it upon themselves to teach themselves how to do the audio editing, what the best practices are. I actually have a background in a former life of working in radio, so I come to it with a above average knowledge of how to create decent sounding audio, and I've tried to pass that on to the other teams as much as we can. Again, a large group is technical, so they love to geek out and really get in there and try to make it as good as possible. The other benefit is, again, our team being embedded on the training side of things. We leverage tools like Captivate, Zoom meetings, and there's a couple different programs internally over the past few years that have been built around enabling our subject matter experts, which basically are our audience, to create training content for other people in the country in the company. So we've actually distributed out some different podcasting kits in essence to the field. So we've got some content experts as well as some expert equipment out there floating around in our ecosystem that people have been able to leverage. All that being said, we also do have a corporate function that does do some media production at our headquarters in Palo Alto. We leverage them for many of the higher production podcasts, so things that would be from a CEO or a CFO reaching out to their audience. We'll leverage our actual in-house studio, and we'll produce broadcast quality material from that perspective. But really, in my opinion, the key is finding the passionate amateur, the prosumer in the audience that wants to take it to the next level, and give them enough budget to get the Adobe Studio, to get a decent microphone and a mixer if you need to, and just show them how to use it. I think that's the key to really building up the podcast culture and keeping it going, is finding people that really want to take it on and give them what they need to make it happen.
I would agree with you. And there's a lot to kind of unpack there too, because there's so much gear that you could have. And if you're like a public podcast who's really more talent driven, there's obviously different solutions for you. But when you're creating corporate and internal training and you're talking about things that you're going to have people get validated on and making sure that your content is as clear as possible, you want to go ahead and make sure that the audio and the production is where it needs to be. What are some of your go-to, let's say, hardware and software that you use? I believe you said at the beginning you were using Audition.
Yeah, that's just because I've been an Adobe junkie forever. But yeah, I mean, I think I even have a template email in my Outlook folder that basically, when someone reaches out, how do I make a podcast? It's, and they ask all the same questions. How long should it be? How do I go about recording it? And again, I go back to my... probably a little archaic now, but some of my radio roots. I remember them saying, or me asking how long do I talk? When do I need to shut up? And basically the advice that I have always hung on is, as long as you have something interesting to say, then people will listen. If you start rambling on and being uninteresting, then you should know that that's time to hang it up. And obviously, if you look at the world of podcasting, you have Dan Carlin fans that will, like me, that will listen for 3 hours, and you have Gary Vee fans that won't, that really dial in for those shorter 7-minute podcasts sometimes. So it really depends on your audience, your subject matter, and making sure that there's a reason to put out a podcast or to listen to it. But when it comes down to the technical questions, I would say I always default to the simplest possible, and I just tell them to record a Zoom meeting. So if it's a particular person who wants to do a first-person podcast, so me addressing the troops, open up Zoom, record it. It'll give you easy access to an MP3 file when you download it, or an MP4 that you can convert. So that's simple, and you can kind of teach them some basic editing there too, if necessary. When it is someone higher up in the company, or we have an interview where there's more than one person, I always advise them to do, again, if you've got a good connection, you can do that on Zoom, but if possible, be in the same room together and use a simple microphone to record that way. I'll refrain from giving actual hardware advice because, again, I tend to err on the broadcast side of things, so all of my suggestions are going to be way out of budget, but I'm just kind of spoiled that way. So otherwise, again, if it sounds good, or if what you have to say is important enough, the audio quality will be secondary for sure. I mean, it can't be complete, can't be painful to listen to, but it's more important that what you say is good rather than it sounds absolutely perfect.
I couldn't agree more with you. And when you are invested in what the person's saying, sometimes that audio quality can leave something to be desired, but you hardly notice that the audio quality is a little bit less than someone who's in, let's say, a $100,000 studio. But if the content of what you're talking about is engaging and it's something that you find value with, you're willing to kind of forego some of that quality.
Yeah, and I think especially with our audience, we're a very global organization. I live in Zoom. I live on WebEx in my day job, as does most of the other folks that are in a globally distributed organization. There's always, it's either you or somebody else that has a bad connection. So, that's just kind of a fact of life. Unfortunately, we're all kind of gotten used to that, unfortunately. But again, as long as it's not painful to listen to, it's probably not as important to sound, like you said, broadcast quality or CD quality out of the gate. Focus more on the content and then upgrade the material once you get the buy-in and the budget. And you can always upgrade to a better system, and I advise that you should. But it's more important that you get out there and get started.
Of course. Now with VMware, are you guys doing just audio podcasts, or are you doing video podcasting as well?
No, so we again are leveraging content that may be coming from other sources and putting it into the podcast channel. So sometimes it is a corporate video. It's something that's produced by our studio, by our in-house studio, and then that's being distributed via this mechanism. Other times it is a Zoom recording. So like for product launch training, for example, there are times where we will take a snippet of a formal training, carve that out and push it to a particular audience via the podcast channel, just as a way of reminding them or reinforcing something that they're supposed to have already heard. But it's just a bite-sized, again, our goal is to train them to subscribe to the channel and then listen to it sometime over the week, couple of weeks or months, when they get the free time or when they get the ability to. I wish I could keep up on all my podcasts, week by week, but that's just not the case, right? So when I go and I binge watch or I binge listen to Reply All, and I haven't been on there for a couple of months, that's kind of the same activity we want our audience to have as well. That there's always a good drip feed of content and information out there to both reinforce and educate and make sure they know about the new things that are happening. But we typically don't put incredibly time-sensitive information out that way, just because we're expecting people to consume it as they want. Or tying this back to the training that we do, we typically develop a training plan that needs to be consumed every quarter. So they have, roughly 2.5, 3 months or so to consume that content. We don't mandate that they consume it all in a week. So there's always, some content that needs to be evergreen or always applicable out there. It can't be incredibly time sensitive because you're just not sure everyone's going to listen to it at the same time.
Of course. And the fact that you were bringing up the evergreen content as opposed to time sensitive is super important too. When you're talking about evergreen content, you want to make sure that it's something that you're not just listening to once. You can always go back to it, and there's always a reason for you to go back. And that's a lot of your internal training. But the time sensitivity audio content or video content, those can come in like the form of newsletters, things like that. And, there's the ability to leverage both. But with you guys, it seems like there's a lot of focus on training, which is great. The last question I have for you, do you see that the podcasting medium helps deliver information in an easier, more digestible format? I think over time, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but let's say you're on a plane or you're on the go and in transit, while something like email can be extremely mobile, there is a little bit of modernization that has happened in the world of podcasting, the ability to listen to it offline. So do you feel that podcasting has helped digest the information a little bit more in 2019?
Yeah, I definitely, and again, I'll go back to my my roots in broadcasting, and as I transitioned off the air, I went into sales, as unfortunately everybody tries to do, just because you never make enough money doing it otherwise. But I mean, obviously, when you talk about radio or TV or anything like that, especially when you talk about advertising, it's about frequency, and I think that's something that a lot of people on the content consumption side forget about, or even the content creation side forget about. You know, you've got to hear that information probably in more than one medium several times before it truly resonates with you and you are willing to make a change, or that really sinks in, right? So for us, that can be, as I said, a launch training where it's a formal training event where you're asked to log in and view something in a Zoom or a WebEx. But you may be multitasking, right? So you may not get all of that. Then there might be a portion of that has been cut out and remixed with other content that you hear a week later in a podcast. And then you might get an email follow-up, or it might be part of a newsletter. So this is the same thing again in that cheat sheet that I give to all the folks wanting to do podcasts. You've got to promote the information more than just the podcast itself, right? If you expect your audience to change or to learn something or to modify their behavior in some way, just because you put out a podcast about it isn't enough. You've got to reinforce that message. Well, first of all, you've got to reinforce that the podcast is there. Then you've got to reinforce that message over and over again in other ways as well. So again, it's frequency. It's playing the advertising game with your audience. Even when it's training or internal marketing is kind of the way that we phrase it internally, right? We want to market to them that this new asset is available or this new training is available. So it's important that we communicate in all the media available to us, newsletter. If we had billboards, we'd use billboards, but we don't. So we have email, we have newsletters, we do have banners, right, on SharePoint sites, different things like that. That's where you can really make a difference in getting the message across. And again, podcast plays a huge role there. And I'm super happy that we were able to get it added to the arsenal a couple of years ago, and it's grown as much as it has. It's been fantastic.
And I like what you said too about the follow-up, because podcasting is a tool. Podcasting is something that you can use to help reinforce what you're selling to people, or rather what you're having them get trained on. What advice would you have for any businesses that are looking to incorporate private podcasting or internal communications podcasting into their network that are kind of on the fence about it?
Yeah, again, I think the key is understanding that it's not going to go to 100 overnight. It's going to take some ramp up, some adoption time. So definitely, and again, this is more just general podcasting guidelines, right? So the same things I've heard in lots of, I think there's a great creative, no affiliation, but there's a great creative live podcasting training session that I remember sitting in on a couple of years ago. All of those advice would apply to a corporate podcast just as much as any other one. Make sure that you give it time to build up. Make sure that you've got content in the bag before you launch. Don't start with one episode and then wonder what to do next. And make sure that you've got promotion in other ways, right? Just because the podcast is out there doesn't guarantee people are going to see it. You need to advertise that podcast to your audience using the other media that they consume on a daily basis, whether it's email, mentioning in a meeting, billboards if you got them, or signs in the cafeteria, whatever it happens to be, right? Just so promote the fact that you're there and commit to it for a decent amount of time before you make the call as to whether or not it is a good fit or not. You've got to make sure that you get enough momentum behind it to make it successful.
Marty, thanks so much again for coming on our podcast and speaking about how VMware uses internal communications podcast in their business. Thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for joining us for Podcasting Smarter. You can check our show notes at podcast.podbean.com for links and details. Please like our podcast, leave your comments, and help us spread the word to other podcasters so we can bring you more great episodes with podcasting tips and inspiration from fellow podcasters. If you want to connect with other podcasters or get interviewed on this podcast, please join our Podcasting Smarter Facebook group. We look forward to welcoming you to the community. Happy podcasting!